Hi, and Happy New Year. Um, it's been amazing to have a 2-week break, and I hope that everything went well for you over the holiday period. And now it's time to kind of really get back into 2025. So welcome once again to the first episode of the Architecture of Change. And I'm Leanne Mair, your host. And it's really funny. I'm not sure if it's fun. I'm not sure if funny is actually the appropriate word, but um, we're starting on an end note, which feels kind of strange, but rhythmically, I thought that it works really well for the fact that depending on how, irrespective, I should say, irrespective of how you organize your life, um, January, even if you follow an academic program, is still a point, an inflection point, and a point of reflection as well. And through this series of designing differently, we've come to do several things which I really enjoyed. We've looked at the architecture of choice and understanding how choice really operates. We've looked at recognizing patterns. We've looked at the success paradox. We've explored strategic design. And today is the culmination of all of those things, where we start to look at, what do I do next? What happens next? So where do we start in designing our next chapter? And I'm going to say the first question is, what is your relationship to time? Because designing differently means that the relationship to time has to fundamentally change. Most of the time, the thing that we believe is that we're time poor. Excuse me. And sometimes we are, but sometimes it's not that we're time poor. It's just how we've managed our time is not in recognition and respect of our rhythms. It's not in respect of our needing to take, if you've been watching my series on principles of lifestyle architecture, one of the things I talk about is the principle of the empty chair. It's not about taking intentional space to be creative, strategic, whatever it might be that you want to use at that point. Because a lot of the times we're encouraged to think big, but at the same time, know all the details. And the first thing we say is, oh, I don't have enough time for this. I don't have enough time. Like, how am I meant to find time when I barely have time to X, Y, Z? How can I find time when I don't have time to see my friends? I don't have time to spend enough time with my kids, my partner, etc., etc. And that's the first, the first point of difference. The first thing that we need to kind of look at is, how do I reacquaint myself with how I view time and how time actually realistically works with, and or in some cases against me? Because if you look at what we're meant to be, and meant to be being, in inverted commas, what we're meant to be doing, there's in many cases, not very much time for that. I saw a video, and I can't remember where, but there was somebody that was just basically saying that we are constantly at a time deficit for the fact that we work 8 hours a week. I mean, 8 hours a week, if only 8 hours a day, right? We're at a time deficit as it is, which requires that we become more creative around how we use that time to be able to do something different. Because in many cases, we're still trying to, even when we're thinking and we're trying to design differently, we're trying to design differently within the parameters of what we already know, within the time parameters of what we already know, as opposed to, let me take a step back and what does my life look like? And what would be the optimum way for me to operate? Now, that might not mean that you reduce your hours at work. It might just mean how you construct those days looks slightly different. Because as we talked about in the earlier episode around the architecture of choice, in many things, we might not have a real, genuine choice. However, we always have an element of agency. Now, it might not be to the extent that we would like it to be, but hey, that can be worked on. But we still have to start to engage with this idea of time is constant, time keeps moving. So if you're still and time keeps moving, it means you're going backwards. So we still need to keep moving with time. The moment we almost say, oh no, I want to stop here, that stopping leads to stagnation, which means that we can no longer design differently because we're still in that same spot. And I think when you kind of realize that if I am not growing, I'm stagnating, I think that's a really good point as to when you go, oh, now I need to move. Growth is change, change is growth. So that is the part where you start to realize, excuse me, I can't carry on as I am. And it's usually something, I'm going to say it's usually something instinctual. A lot of the times when change happens, it's not because there's always this massive event, a huge trigger event that says, oh, everything's going to be different from now on. Usually it is a very instinctual feeling sitting all the way in that vagus nerve that says to you, this situation is no longer tenable. And the reason why we often don't tend to make any changes is because when we're trying to explain to somebody else, oh, and whether it's your best friend, your partner, a colleague, someone you trust, whatever, when you're trying to explain that the situation is untenable, a lot of the times we lack the articulation, we lack the exact words where you can say, this is the reason why this situation is untenable, but you feel it. But because in trying to justify it, nobody agrees with you, it becomes really hard to say, okay, all of my trusted people, all of my mentors, my sponsors, my friends, blah, 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 everyone who knows me, they've all said no, they don't see what I'm getting at. That there is another point. It's if you instinctually feel it, don't ignore the instinct. Work with it. Why do I feel this way? What could it be? And do you know when we were kids, I hope this is not politically incorrect, but the game was called Blind Man's Buff, I think, right? Where you'd put a bandage around somebody's eyes and then you twirl them and then you say go and then you'd be like warmer, colder, etc., etc. That's exactly how we have to operate with our instinct. Asking it, is this it? And you'll get that, no, that doesn't feel right. That feels right. And sometimes the things that feel right are very, very strange. But the point is that designing differently and designing that next chapter with intention, because this whole series is about designing differently, and designing that next chapter differently and with intention requires engaging with and leaning into things that you would have poo-pooed or dismissed as being irrelevant and unimportant. So those are so we've got two so far. So we've got time, and then we've got interacting, listening to, developing our instincts, playing that game, hotter, colder, hotter, colder. And above all of that, and this is probably the hardest part in all of this, designing your next chapter differently. And I think we all have this. It's I am not going to try and seek external validation while I'm making these changes. Because as you begin to interact with time differently and you begin to listen to your instincts differently, that is the moment when transformation happens. That is the moment where how you would have made decisions is not how you are starting to make decisions. And there's nothing that triggers transformation also in people than when you decide to change your behavior. You cannot change how they react, but you can definitely put a line in the sand as to how you're going to be. And this is the part of the process that's the exciting part. It's exciting and it's scary because not everybody's going to come along with you on this journey. And you'll find that as you make decisions differently, and here's the third part. So we've had time, we've had vagus nerve, and the third part is as you begin to transform how you interact with time, knowledge, and everything else, this is the part where you have to push your intellectual curiosity to do things differently. Because I think We spoke about this before. So you have like individual change, then you have collective change, then you have, I'm going to leave corporate for the time being, and I'm going to say societal and systematic change. Designing differently also requires that you educate yourself on systems, so that as you become a catalyst for change in which way for your own individual life, you extend that catalytic power into collective transformation, and you extend that then into societal transformation. Because we can look at designing differently as an individual endeavor, but in order for us to make change, it has to be collective endeavors. So designing the next chapter has to be also around that. I am going to do this because it makes my life better. That is a perfectly valid reason. It makes my life better. It makes me better. But in making myself and my life better, I want to also have a positive impact on the collective and start to drive change on a systemic level. And it doesn't mean that, as I said, it doesn't have to mean that you go out there and you're campaigning. That's not what it is. It's more about, how do I think bigger than myself as I go through this process of improving myself? As I go through this process of saying, these are the things I would like to achieve, big level, 5 years, 3, 2, 1, 6 months, 9 months, etc. But it's not just about me. And I think when we get to that point of determining that it's not just about you as the individual, that whole transformation shifts how you show up, but it also shifts the opportunities that you will receive based on this. I'm not going to call it a newfound confidence. I'm going to call this newfound view as to how you interact with all these three elements. You interact with time differently, which means that there is not that desperation to always constantly be in response to something. You are not reactive. You've created time and space to be creative, strategic. You listen to your instinct, which means that you're recognizing when an opportunity isn't an opportunity, and you engage with your power of saying no. But above and beyond that, you're nourishing yourself with knowledge to mean that when you're getting into these conversations, the conversations are deeper. The conversations not only meaningful, but they also showcase your intellectual curiosity and your ability to do more than what anything could stay on a piece of paper. We have to sell ourselves on pieces of paper. We have to sell ourselves on taglines. We have to sell ourselves on, paper, whatever it might be. But rarely does that piece of paper, that tagline, encapsulate who and what you are and what you can do. But your presence, your responses, your interactions, all of those things will change and shift. And maybe it will bring you closer to power. And even if it doesn't, it will bring you strategic advantages, because every step that you take is with intention. Others might not see the vision. That's completely fine. But when you decide to design that next chapter, the multi-layered work that's required is saying, I am going to do this for me, but I'm also looking at a bigger, different picture. I recognize opportunities for me, but I also, and I didn't say this before, but this is a really important point, I also recognize opportunities for others. Sometimes your role isn't to be the person who executes. Sometimes you're there to connect. But if you're not sitting in that space of designing differently, you don't give yourself the opportunity to see those moments. You don't give yourself the opportunity to go, do you know something? This is not for me. This is not for Leanne, but this is for, and I will make that connection. Because designing our next chapter is as easy as saying, today I'm closing out, just like I'm closing out the series. This is the season finale of Designing Differently. Just as we're closing this out, boom, tomorrow is the start of a new day. And tomorrow means that I will choose to interact with things differently. Tomorrow means that I am not going to do all the same things that I did before, because I'm going to start with something new. And in each of the episodes, I've tried to kind of talk about small changes, large impact, incremental changes. I don't ever believe with a complete overhaul and dropping everything that you did before. Um, because when it gets to that point, if you try and drop everything, then you also drop your expertise, your knowledge, and all the things that make you you. It's not about changing, it's about positioning two things together. On the one hand, we have story acceptance, which is, this has been my story thus far, and these are the things that I've liked about it, and these are the things that I haven't liked about it. But then there's this side, which is story architecture. The things that I don't like are the things that in this part of my story, I'm going to change. How I'm going to change it is the bit that I've never really asked myself. And is the change something that's a me thing? Is it a me problem, or is it an external problem? Because when you ask that question, it really changes. Our imperfections will remain our imperfections. And what I mean by that is, it might be something different, but we're not going to be perfect. And that is perfectly fine, right? It's perfectly fine for it to not be perfect. But we have to give ourselves the grace in accepting our story, and accepting that this story got us to this point, but now we want to do something different. Now we want to change certain things. Now we want to architect the next part. And that's where the question of, what is it that didn't work? What is it that I didn't like? I accept it's part of my story. I'm grateful for this part of my story. But how do I then transport that into architecting something very new and different for myself? And we see it, right? I think I've spoken in several episodes around A, not being ready for opportunity, but B, waiting for it. Changing how we do things. Am I going to create the opportunity, or am I going to wait for opportunity? Asking those same questions. Am I going to build my power, or am I going to seek somebody else's power? Questions. And power doesn't always have to mean, excuse me, that you're at the top of the tree, right? It doesn't always have to mean that. The question is your power and your ability to exert change in different situations. Do I want to design a system that works for me and others? Or do I just simply want to, and that is also okay. Do I just simply want to navigate the existing system? Not everybody wants to change things, but being aware of what you want, and being aware of what you want and being happy with that decision becomes a very critical part. And the reason why I say that is, there's a lot of people who are complaining about navigating, but they're not prepared to design, right? And that's the complaining part is not okay if you're not going to accept who you are. Story acceptance, personality acceptance. If that is not for you, that's okay. Just like there is no hierarchy. A person who's an entrepreneur is not better than somebody that has a 9-to-5 job. There is no difference. This is recognizing skill set and what works for you. So the question is always around, what works for me? And have I accepted that? Or do I consistently buck against that? And then I get frustrated with myself because people think, oh, you don't ever deliver. You don't really do that, but it was nice while you thought about it. So ask yourself those questions. Like, not all of them are antagonistic, but it's really important to know and recognize, like, who am I? What am I? Who do I want to be? Where do I want to be? And, whether we all like it or not, we are cogs in the system. So what kind of cog do I want to be? Am I going to be a cog that gets to change sometimes? Am I a big one? Am I a small one? Am I a lever? Like, where do I fit in? And have I reconciled with myself that I am okay to fit in here? Because we're not always okay with it. Sometimes we are not okay with it. And that is the question that we have to continue to make sure that as we're going to design that chapter, that we recognize our limitations, our triggers, our stressors, our reactions to stressors. Because if you are a bury your head in the sand kind of person, when stress happens, then there's no point in you saying, I'm just going to meet it head on, because you're never going to do that, because it's just not in you. And that is okay. But it's accepting the parts of ourselves, even the parts that we don't really like, accepting them and working with them to then create that change in the next chapter. Because your next chapter should always be exciting. And when I say exciting, I mean still fear, a healthy fear, because it's unknown, right? But you should still be excited at the prospect of, I'm going to be doing this different thing, and I don't even know what this different thing is. But what I do know is I've spent my time going through my stressors. I've spent my time planning. And when I say planning, it's planning more around you as the individual, rather than the completely planning around the outcomes and the outputs, right? Because we can have plans, but sometimes they do not go as intended. But we are able to adapt. We're able to adapt. But there should be this excitement around it, excitement and fear, and a little bit of anticipation. And when I say, and it's not just worst case scenarios, it's just like, what is the most likely behavior if this happens? What is my tendency? What am I going to do? It's okay to think about that. It's okay to be honest and be like, oh, well, I don't want to admit it, but I'd probably just run away screaming. Because we plan for good things, as we should, but and we plan for worst case scenarios, but we don't plan for like, what's the middle of the road scenario that might stress me out, but it's critical to where I'm trying to get to. And it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if it happened, but it'd be less than ideal. Sometimes we don't think about the full range of our emotions. We think about the extreme happiness and the extreme sadness or anger or disappointment. But the middle of the road, it's just a meh, but it still needs to be navigated somehow. And this is where I think about several things. And I'm looking in my mind's eye, because I'm trying to make sure that I get them out correctly. So, 1, pattern transformation. So looking at the things you've done and where it needs to be. Story acceptance versus story architecture. 2, what can you build in terms of support systems as well as real systems to help you on that next design chapter? Who should be in your toolkit, as it were, whether it's therapist, whether it's lifestyle architect, whether it's executive advisor, whether it's nutritionist, who should be in that fundamental toolkit to help you get to where you need to get to, and providing you with the correct support. And then the 4th one is, hold on, did I say pattern transformation? System creation, support structure. And then the final one is designing your next chapters should not come at the cost of and implementing those changes should not come at the cost of your health, your wealth, and your peace of mind. So setting realistic goals, because once you've done all of the analysis as to like, how am I really, all of that stuff, once you've done all of that, it becomes really clear who and or what you're capable of. And if you're still unsure, then it might mean you need to spend a little bit more time going through that process, right? But it shouldn't mean that designing your next chapter is a precursor to burnout. It shouldn't mean that you feel pressured by designing this next chapter. There should be, after you've put the work in, after you've engaged with time differently, after you've really thought about leaning in and listening to your instincts, after you've also really started to dig into, there will be no conclusion, but dig into learning more. These should all lead to a feeling of freedom and that a burden has been lifted. And if it feels like an extra burden, then we need to go back and start to design your next chapter again, but also design it differently. Because this should be the moment that you feel like, yes, I'm so excited about this. My next chapter isn't just going to happen to me. It's something that I have designed. I have architected this. So my last words are this. Please continue architecting change, because today's design is tomorrow's reality. And that is what I want for each of you as we go through this podcast, is remembering that today's design is tomorrow's reality. We just need to keep finding the space, the time, the passion. Not keep finding it. In fact, I used the wrong words there. We need to keep creating it so that we begin to architect the life, the society, the collective that we really genuinely do want to see. So as always, thank you for listening. Please give reviews, comments, feedback. And I hope you enjoyed another episode of Architecture of Change. Thank you. Bye.